You had lunch with us here just a day or so ago, didn't you, Father? He asked meaningfully. Yes, sir, the day before yesterday. That's what I thought, Colonel Korn said, and paused to let his point sink in. Well, take it easy, Father. I'll see you around when it's time for you to eat here again. Thank you, sir. The chaplain was not certain at which of the 5 officers and 5 enlisted men's mess halls he was scheduled to have lunch that day, for the system of rotation worked out for him by Colonel Korn was complicated, and he had forgotten his records back in his tent. The chaplain was the only officer attached to Group Headquarters who did not reside in the moldering Redstone Group Headquarters building itself, or in any of the smaller satellite structures that rose about the grounds in disjuncted relationship. The chaplain lived in a clearing in the woods about 4 miles away between the Officers' Club and the first of the 4 squadron areas that stretched away from Group Headquarters in a distant line. The chaplain lived alone in a spacious square tent that was also his office. Sounds of revelry traveled to him at night from the Officers' Club and kept him awake often as he turned and tossed on his cot in passive, half-voluntary exile. He was not able to gauge the effect of the mild pills he took occasionally to help him sleep, and felt guilty about for days afterward. The only one who lived with the chaplain in his clearing in the woods was Corporal Whitcomb, his assistant. Corporal Whitcomb, an atheist, was a disgruntled subordinate who felt he could do the chaplain's job much better than the chaplain was doing it, and viewed himself, therefore, as an underprivileged victim of social inequity. He lived in a tent of his own, as spacious and square as the chaplain's. He was openly rude and contemptuous to the chaplain once he discovered that the chaplain would let him get away with it. The borders of the 2 tents in the clearing stood no more than 4 or 5 feet apart. It was Colonel Korn who had mapped out this way of life for the chaplain. One good reason for making the chaplain live outside the Group Headquarters building was Colonel Korn's theory that dwelling in a tent, as most of his parishioners did, would bring him into closer communication with them. Another good reason was the fact that having the chaplain around headquarters all the time made the other officers uncomfortable. It was one thing to maintain liaison with the Lord, and they were all in favor of that. It was something else, though, to have him hanging around 24 hours a day. All in all, as Colonel Korn described it to Major Danby, the jittery and goggle-eyed group operations officer, the chaplain had it pretty soft. He had little more to do than listen to the troubles of others, bury the dead, visit the bedridden, and conduct religious services. And there were not so many dead for him to bury anymore, Colonel Korn pointed out, since opposition from German fighter planes had virtually ceased, and since close to 90% of what fatalities there still were, he estimated, perished behind the enemy lines or disappeared inside clouds where the chaplain had nothing to do with disposing of the remains. The religious services were certainly no great strain either, since they were conducted only once a week at the Group Headquarters building and were attended by very few of the men. Actually, the chaplain was learning to love it in his clearing in the woods. Both he and Corporal Whitcomb had been provided with every convenience, so that neither might ever plead discomfort as a basis for seeking permission to return to the headquarters building. The chaplain rotated his breakfasts, lunches, and dinners in separate sets among the 8 squadron mess halls, and ate every 5th meal in the enlisted men's mess at Group Headquarters and every 10th meal at the officers' mess there. Back home in Wisconsin, the chaplain had been very fond of gardening, and his heart welled with a glorious impression of fertility and fruition each time he contemplated the low, prickly boughs of the stunted trees and the waist-high weeds and thickets by which he was almost walled in. In the spring, he had longed to plant begonias and zinnias in a narrow bed around his tent, but he had been deterred by his fear of Corporal Whitcomb's rancor. The chaplain relished the privacy and isolation of his verdant surroundings and the reverie and meditation that living there fostered. Fewer people came to him with their troubles than formerly, and he allowed himself a measure of gratitude for that, too. The chaplain did not mix freely and was not comfortable in conversation. He missed his wife and his 3 small children, and she missed him. What displeased Corporal Whitcomb most about the chaplain, apart from the fact that the chaplain believed in God, was his lack of initiative and aggressiveness. Corporal Whitcomb regarded the low attendance at religious services as a sad reflection of his own status. His mind germinated feverishly with challenging new ideas for sparking the great spiritual revival of which he dreamed himself the architect. Box lunches, church socials, form letters to the families of men killed and injured in combat, censorship, bingo. But the chaplain blocked him. Corporal Whitcomb bridled with vexation beneath the chaplain's restraint, for he spied room for improvement everywhere. It was people like the chaplain, he concluded, who were responsible for giving religion such a bad name and making pariahs out of them both. Unlike the chaplain, Corporal Whitcomb detested the seclusion of the clearing in the woods. One of the first things he intended to do after he deposed the chaplain was move back into the group headquarters building, where he could be right in the thick of things. When the chaplain drove back into the clearing after leaving Colonel Korn, Corporal Whitcomb was outside in the muggy haze, talking in conspiratorial tones to a strange, chubby man in a maroon corduroy bathrobe and gray flannel pajamas. The chaplain recognized the bathrobe and pajamas as official hospital attire. Neither of the two men gave him any sign of recognition. The stranger's gums had been painted purple. His corduroy bathrobe was decorated in back with a picture of a B-25 nosing through orange bursts of flak, and in front with 6 neat rows of tiny bombs signifying 60 combat missions flown. The chaplain was so struck by the sight that he stopped to stare. Both men broke off their conversation and waited in stony silence for him to go. The chaplain hurried inside his tent. He heard, or imagined he heard, them tittering. Corporal Whitcomb walked in a moment later and demanded, "What's doing?" "There isn't anything new," the chaplain replied with averted eyes. "Was anyone here to see me?" "Just that crackpot Yossarian again. He's a real troublemaker, isn't he?" "I'm not so sure he's a crackpot," the chaplain observed. "That's right. Take his part," said Corporal Whitcomb in an injured tone, and stamped out. The chaplain could not believe that Corporal Whitcomb was offended again, and had really walked out. As soon as he did realize it, Corporal Whitcomb walked back in. "You always side with other people," Corporal Whitcomb accused. "You don't back up your men. That's one of the things that's wrong with you." "I didn't intend to side with him," the chaplain apologized. "I was just making a statement." "What did Colonel Cathcart want?" "It wasn't anything important. He just wanted to discuss the possibility of saying prayers in the briefing room before each mission." "All right, don't tell me," Corporal Whitcomb snapped, and walked out again. The chaplain felt terrible. No matter how considerate he tried to be, it seemed he always managed to hurt Corporal Whitcomb's feelings. He gazed down remorsefully and saw that the orderly, forced upon him by Colonel Korn to keep his tent clean and attend to his belongings, had neglected to shine his shoes again. Corporal Whitcomb came back in. "You never trust me with information," he whined truculently. "You don't have confidence in your men. That's another one of the things that's wrong with you." "Yes, I do," the chaplain assured him guiltily. "I have lots of confidence in you." "Then how about those letters?" "No, not now," the chaplain pleaded, cringing. "Not the letters. Please don't bring that up again. I'll let you know if I have a change of mind." Corporal Whitcomb looked furious. "Is that so? Well, it's all right for you to just sit there and shake your head while I do all the work. Didn't you see that guy outside with all those pictures painted on his bathrobe? Is he here to see me?" "No," Corporal Whitcomb said, and walked out. It was hot and humid inside the tent, and the chaplain felt himself turning damp. He listened like an unwilling eavesdropper to the muffled, indistinguishable drone of the lowered voices outside. As he sat inertly at the rickety bridge table that served as a desk, his lips were closed, his eyes were blank, and his face, with its pale ochre hue and ancient confined clusters of minute acne pits, had the color and texture of an uncracked almond shell. He racked his memory for some clue to the origin of Corporal Whitcomb's bitterness toward him. In some way he was unable to fathom. He was convinced he had done him some unforgivable wrong. It seemed incredible that such lasting ire as Corporal Whitcomb's could have stemmed from his rejection of bingo or the form letters home to the families of the men killed in combat. The chaplain was despondent with an acceptance of his own ineptitude. He had intended for some weeks to have a heart-to-heart talk with Corporal Whitcomb in order to find out what was bothering him, but was already ashamed of what he might find out. Outside the tent, Corporal Whitcomb snickered. The other man chuckled. For a few precarious seconds, the chaplain tingled with a weird occult sensation of having experienced the identical situation before in some prior time or existence. He endeavored to trap and nourish the impression in order to predict and perhaps even control what incident would occur next. But the afflatus melted away unproductively, as he had known beforehand it would. Déjà vu, the subtle, recurring confusion between illusion and reality that was characteristic of paramnesia, fascinated the chaplain, and he knew a number of things about it. He knew, for example, that it was called paramnesia, and he was interested as well in such corollary optical phenomena as jamais vu, never seen, and presque vu, almost seen. There were terrifying, sudden moments when objects, concepts, and even people that the chaplain had lived with almost all his life inexplicably took on an unfamiliar and irregular aspect that he had never seen before, and which made them seem totally strange, jamais vu. And there were other moments when he almost saw absolute truth in brilliant flashes of clarity that almost came to him, presque vu. The episode of the naked man in the tree at Snowden's funeral mystified him thoroughly. It was not déjà vu, for at the time he had experienced no sensation of ever having seen a naked man in a tree at Snowden's funeral before. It was not jamais vu, since the apparition was not of someone or something familiar appearing to him in an unfamiliar guise. And it was certainly not presque vu, for the chaplain did see him. A jeep started up with a backfire directly outside and roared away. Had the naked man in the tree at Snowden's funeral been merely a hallucination, or had it been a true revelation? The chaplain trembled at the mere idea. He wanted desperately to confide in Yossarian, but each time he thought about the occurrence, he decided not to think about it any further, although now that he did think about it, he could not be sure that he ever really had thought about it. Corporal Whitcomb sauntered back in, wearing a shiny new smirk, and leaned his elbow impertinently against the center pole of the chaplain's tent. "Do you know who that guy in the red bathrobe was?" he asked boastfully. "That was a CID man with a fractured nose. He came down here from the hospital on official business. He's conducting an investigation." The chaplain raised his eyes quickly in obsequious commiseration. "I hope you're not in any trouble. Is there anything I can do?" "No, I'm not in any trouble," Corporal Whitcomb replied with a grin. "You are. They're going to crack down on you for signing Washington Irving's name to all those letters you've been signing Washington Irving's name to. How do you like that?" "I haven't been signing Washington Irving's name to any letters," said the chaplain. "You don't have to lie to me," Corporal Whitcomb answered. "I'm not the one you have to convince." "But I'm not lying." "I don't care whether you're lying or not. They're going to get you for intercepting Major Major's correspondence, too. A lot of that stuff is classified information." "What correspondence?" asked the chaplain plaintively in rising exasperation. "I've never even seen any of Major Major's correspondence." "You don't have to lie to me," Corporal Whitcomb replied. "I'm not the one you have to convince." "But I'm not lying," protested the chaplain. "I don't see why you have to shout at me," Corporal Whitcomb retorted with an injured look. He came away from the center pole and shook his finger at the chaplain for emphasis. "I just did you the biggest favor anybody ever did you in your whole life, and you don't even realize it. Every time he tries to report you to his superiors, somebody up at the hospital censors out the details. He's been going batty for weeks trying to turn you in. I just put a censor's okay on his letter without even reading it. That will make a very good impression for you up at CID headquarters. It will let them know that we're not the least bit afraid to have the whole truth about you come out." The chaplain was reeling with confusion. "But you aren't authorized to censor letters, are you?" "Of course not," Corporal Whitcomb answered. "Only officers are ever authorized to do that. I censored it in your name." "But I'm not authorized to censor letters either, am I?" "I took care of that for you, too," Corporal Whitcomb assured him. "I signed somebody else's name for you." "Isn't that forgery?" "Oh, don't worry about that either. The only one who might complain in a case of forgery is the person whose name you forged, and I looked out for your interests by picking a dead man. I used Washington Irving's name." Corporal Whitcomb scrutinized the chaplain's face closely for some sign of rebellion, and then breezed ahead confidently with concealed irony. "That was pretty quick thinking on my part, wasn't it?" "I don't know," the chaplain wailed softly in a quavering voice, squinting with grotesque contortions of anguish and incomprehension. "I don't think I understand all you've been telling me. How will it make a good impression for me if you signed Washington Irving's name instead of my own? Because they're convinced that you are Washington Irving, don't you see? They'll know it was you." But isn't that the very belief we want to dispel? Won't this help them prove it? If I thought you were going to be so stuffy about it, I wouldn't even have tried to help, Corporal Whitcomb declared indignantly and walked out. A second later, he walked back in. I just did you the biggest favor anybody ever did you in your whole life, and you don't even know it. You don't know how to show your appreciation. That's another one of the things that's wrong with you. I'm sorry, the chaplain apologized contritely. I really am sorry. It's just that I'm so completely stunned by all you're telling me that I don't even realize what I'm saying. I'm really very grateful to you. Then how about letting me send out those form letters? Corporal Whitcomb demanded immediately. Can I begin working on the first drafts? The chaplain's jaw dropped in astonishment. No, he groaned. Not now. Corporal Whitcomb was incensed. I'm the best friend you've got, and you don't even know it, he asserted belligerently, and walked out of the chaplain's tent. He walked back in. I'm on your side, and you don't even realize it. Don't you know what serious trouble you're in? That CID man has gone rushing back to the hospital to write a brand new report on you about that tomato. What tomato? The chaplain asked, blinking. The plum tomato you were hiding in your hand when you first showed up here. There it is. The tomato you're still holding in your hand right this very minute. The chaplain unclenched his fingers with surprise and saw that he was still holding the plum tomato he had obtained in Colonel Cathcart's office. He set it down quickly on the bridge table. I got this tomato from Colonel Cathcart, he said, and was struck by how ludicrous his explanation sounded. He insisted I take it. You don't have to lie to me, Corporal Whitcomb answered. I don't care whether you stole it from him or not. Stole it? The chaplain exclaimed with amazement. Why should I want to steal a plum tomato? That's exactly what had us both stumped, said Corporal Whitcomb. And then the CID man figured out you might have some important secret papers hidden away inside it. The chaplain sagged limply beneath the mountainous weight of his despair. I don't have any important secret papers hidden away inside it, he stated simply. I didn't even want it to begin with. Here, you can have it. Take it and see for yourself. I don't want it. Please, take it away, the chaplain pleaded in a voice that was barely audible. I want to be rid of it. I don't want it, Corporal Whitcomb snapped again, and stalked out with an angry face, suppressing a smile of great jubilation at having forged a powerful new alliance with the CID man, and at having succeeded again in convincing the chaplain that he was really displeased. Poor Whitcomb, sighed the chaplain, and blamed himself for his assistant's malaise. He sat mutely in a ponderous, stultifying melancholy, waiting expectantly for Corporal Whitcomb to walk back in. He was disappointed as he heard the peremptory crunch of Corporal Whitcomb's footsteps recede into silence. There was nothing he wanted to do next. He decided to pass up lunch for a Milky Way and a Baby Ruth from his footlocker, and a few swallows of lukewarm water from his canteen. He felt himself surrounded by dense, overwhelming fogs of possibilities in which he could perceive no glimmer of light. He dreaded what Colonel Cathcart would think when the news that he was suspected of being Washington Irving was brought to him, then fell to fretting over what Colonel Cathcart was already thinking about him for even having broached the subject of the 60 missions. There was so much unhappiness in the world, he reflected, bowing his head dismally beneath the tragic thought, and there was nothing he could do about anybody's, least of all his own. Chapter 21, General Dreedle. Colonel Cathcart was not thinking anything at all about the chaplain, but was tangled up in a brand new, menacing problem of his own, Yossarian. Yossarian! The mere sound of that execrable, ugly name made his blood run cold, and his breath come in labored gasps. The chaplain's first mention of the name Yossarian had tolled deep in his memory like a portentous gong. As soon as the latch of the door had clicked shut, the whole humiliating recollection of the naked man in formation came cascading down upon him in a mortifying, choking flood of stinging details. He began to perspire and tremble. There was a sinister and unlikely coincidence exposed that was too diabolical in implication to be anything less than the most hideous of omens. The name of the man who had stood naked in ranks that day to receive his distinguished flying cross from General Dreedle had also been Yossarian. And now it was a man named Yossarian who was threatening to make trouble over the 60 missions he had just ordered the men in his group to fly. Colonel Cathcart wondered gloomily if it was the same Yossarian. He climbed to his feet with an air of intolerable woe, and began moving about his office. He felt himself in the presence of the mysterious. The naked man in formation, he conceded cheerlessly, had been a real black eye for him. So had the tampering with the bomb line before the mission to Bologna, and the 7-day delay in destroying the bridge at Ferrara, even though destroying the bridge at Ferrara finally, he remembered with glee, had been a real feather in his cap. Although losing a plane there the second time around, he recalled in dejection, had been another black eye. Even though he had won another real feather in his cap by getting a medal approved for the bombardier who had gotten him the real black eye in the first place by going around over the target twice. That bombardier's name, he remembered suddenly with another stupefying shock, had also been Yossarian. Now there were 3. His vicious eyes bulged with astonishment, and he whipped himself around in alarm to see what was taking place behind him. A moment ago there had been no Yossarians in his life. Now they were multiplying like hobgoblins. He tried to make himself grow calm. Yossarian was not a common name. Perhaps there were not really 3 Yossarians, but only 2 Yossarians, or maybe even only 1 Yossarian. But that really made no difference. The colonel was still in grave peril. Intuition warned him that he was drawing close to some immense and inscrutable cosmic climax, and his broad, meaty, towering frame tingled from head to toe at the thought that Yossarian, whoever he would eventually turn out to be, was destined to serve as his nemesis. Colonel Cathcart was not superstitious, but he did believe in omens, and he sat right back down behind his desk and made a cryptic notation on his memorandum pad to look into the whole suspicious business of the Yossarians right away. He wrote his reminder to himself in a heavy and decisive hand, amplifying it sharply with a series of coded punctuation marks and underlining the whole message twice so that it read, Yossarian, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, question mark, exclamation point. The colonel sat back when he had finished and was extremely pleased with himself for the prompt action he had just taken to meet this sinister crisis. Yossarian, the very sight of the name made him shudder. There were so many S's in it. It just had to be subversive. It was like the word subversive itself. It was like seditious and insidious, too, and like socialist, suspicious, fascist, and communist. It was an odious, alien, distasteful name, a name that just did not inspire confidence. It was not at all like such clean, crisp, honest American names as Cathcart, Peckham, and Dreedle. Colonel Cathcart rose slowly and began drifting about his office again. Almost unconsciously, he picked up a plum tomato from the top of one of the bushels and took a voracious bite. He made a wry face at once and threw the rest of the plum tomato into his wastebasket. The colonel did not like plum tomatoes, not even when they were his own, and these were not even his own. These had been purchased in different marketplaces all over Pianosa by Colonel Korn under various identities, moved up to the colonel's farmhouse in the hills in the dead of night, and transported down to group headquarters the next morning for sale to Milo, who paid Colonel Cathcart and Colonel Korn premium prices for them. Colonel Cathcart often wondered if what they were doing with the plum tomatoes was legal, but Colonel Korn said it was, and he tried not to brood about it too often. He had no way of knowing whether or not the house in the hills was legal either, since Colonel Korn had made all the arrangements. Colonel Cathcart did not know if he owned the house or rented it, from whom he had acquired it, or how much, if anything, it was costing. Colonel Korn was the lawyer, and if Colonel Korn assured him that fraud, extortion, currency manipulation, embezzlement, income tax evasion, and black market speculations were legal, Colonel Cathcart was in no position to disagree with him. All Colonel Cathcart knew about his house in the hills was that he had such a house and hated it. He was never so bored as when spending there the 2 or 3 days every other week necessary to sustain the illusion that his damp and drafty stone farmhouse in the hills was a golden palace of carnal delights. Officers' clubs everywhere pulsated with blurred but knowing accounts of lavish, hushed-up drinking and sex orgies there, and of secret, intimate nights of ecstasy with the most beautiful, the most tantalizing, the most readily aroused, and most easily satisfied Italian courtesans, film actresses, models, and countesses. No such private nights of ecstasy or hushed-up drinking and sex orgies ever occurred. They might have occurred if either General Dreedle or General Peckham had once evinced an interest in taking part in orgies with him, but neither ever did. and the colonel was certainly not going to waste his time and energy making love to beautiful women unless there was something in it for him. The colonel dreaded his dank, lonely nights at his farmhouse and the dull, uneventful days. He had much more fun back at group, browbeating everyone he wasn't afraid of. However, as Colonel Korn kept reminding him, there was not much glamour in having a farmhouse in the hills if he never used it. He drove off to his farmhouse each time in a mood of self-pity. He carried a shotgun in his jeep and spent the monotonous hours there shooting at birds and at the plum tomatoes that did grow there in untended rows and were much too much trouble to harvest. Among those officers of inferior rank toward whom Colonel Cathcart still deemed it prudent to show respect, he included Major Blank de Coverley, even though he did not want to, and was not sure he even had to. Major Blank de Coverley was as great a mystery to him as he was to Major, and to everyone else who ever took notice of him. Colonel Cathcart had no idea whether to look up or down in his attitude toward Major Blank de Coverley. Major Blank de Coverley was only a major, even though he was ages older than Colonel Cathcart. At the same time, so many other people treated Major Blank de Coverley with such profound and fearful veneration that Colonel Cathcart had a hunch they might all know something. Major Blank de Coverley was an ominous, incomprehensible presence who kept him constantly on edge, and of whom even Colonel Korn tended to be wary. Everyone was afraid of him, and no one knew why. No one even knew Major Blank de Coverley's first name, because no one had ever had the temerity to ask him. Colonel Cathcart knew that Major Blank de Coverley was away, and he rejoiced in his absence until it occurred to him that Major Blank de Coverley might be away somewhere conspiring against him. And then he wished that Major Blank de Coverley were back in his squadron where he belonged, so that he could be watched. In a little while, Colonel Cathcart's arches began to ache from pacing back and forth so much. He sat down behind his desk again and resolved to embark upon a mature and systematic evaluation of the entire military situation. With the businesslike air of a man who knows how to get things done, he found a large white pad, drew a straight line down the middle, and crossed it near the top, dividing the page into 2 blank columns of equal width. He rested a moment in critical rumination. Then he huddled over his desk, and at the head of the left column, in a cramped and finicky hand, he wrote, "Black eyes." At the top of the right column, he wrote, "Feathers in my cap." He leaned back once more to inspect his chart admiringly from an objective perspective. After a few seconds of solemn deliberation, he licked the tip of his pencil carefully and wrote under black eyes, after intent intervals, "Ferrara. Bologna. Bomb line moved on map during. Skeet range. Naked man in formation after Avignon." Then he added, "Food poisoning during Bologna," and "Moaning. Epidemic of during Avignon briefing." Then he added, "Chaplain, hanging around officers' club every night." He decided to be charitable about the chaplain, even though he did not like him, and under "Feathers in my cap," he wrote, "Chaplain, hanging around officers' club every night." The 2 chaplain entries, therefore, neutralized each other. Alongside Ferrara and naked man in formation after Avignon, he then wrote, "Yossarian." Alongside Bologna, bomb line moved on map during, food poisoning during Bologna, and moaning epidemic of during Avignon briefing, he wrote in a bold, decisive hand, question mark. Those entries labeled question mark were the ones he wanted to investigate immediately to determine if Yossarian had played any part in them. Suddenly his arm began to shake, and he was unable to write any more. He rose to his feet in terror, feeling sticky and fat, and rushed to the open window to gulp in fresh air. His gaze fell on the skeet range, and he reeled away with a sharp cry of distress, his wild and feverish eyes scanning the walls of his office frantically as though they were swarming with Yossarians. Nobody loved him. General Dreedle hated him, although General Peckham liked him, although he couldn't be sure, since Colonel Cargill, General Peckham's aide, undoubtedly had ambitions of his own, and was probably sabotaging him with General Peckham at every opportunity. The only good colonel, he decided, was a dead colonel, except for himself. The only colonel he trusted was Colonel Mudis, and even he had an in with his father-in-law. Milo, of course, had been the big feather in his cap, although having his group bombed by Milo's planes had probably been a terrible black eye for him. Even though Milo had ultimately stilled all protest by disclosing the huge net profit the syndicate had realized on the deal with the enemy, and convincing everyone that bombing his own men and planes had therefore really been a commendable and very lucrative blow on the side of private enterprise. The colonel was insecure about Milo because other colonels were trying to lure him away, and Colonel Cathcart still had that lousy Big Chief White half-vote in his group, who that lousy, lazy Captain Black claimed was the one really responsible for the bomb lines being moved during the big siege of Bologna. Colonel Cathcart liked Big Chief White Half-Oat because Big Chief White Half-Oat kept punching that lousy Colonel Mudis in the nose every time he got drunk, and Colonel Mudis was around. He wished that Big Chief White Half-Oat would begin punching Colonel Korn in his fat face, too. Colonel Korn was a lousy smart-aleck. Someone at 27th Air Force Headquarters had it in for him, and sent back every report he wrote with a blistering rebuke. And Colonel Korn had bribed a clever mail clerk there named Wintergreen to try to find out who it was. Losing that plane over Ferrara the second time around had not done him any good, he had to admit, and neither had having that other plane disappear inside that cloud. That was one he hadn't even written down. He tried to recall, longingly, if Yossarian had been lost in that plane in the cloud, and realized that Yossarian could not possibly have been lost in that plane in the cloud if he was still around now, raising such a big stink about having to fly a lousy 5 missions more. Maybe 60 missions were too many for the men to fly, Colonel Cathcart reasoned, if Yossarian objected to flying them. But he then remembered that forcing his men to fly more missions than everyone else was the most tangible achievement he had going for him. As Colonel Korn often remarked, the war was crawling with group commanders who were merely doing their duty, and it required just some sort of dramatic gesture like making his group fly more combat missions than any other bomber group to spotlight his unique qualities of leadership. Certainly none of the generals seemed to object to what he was doing, although as far as he could detect, they weren't particularly impressed either, which made him suspect that perhaps 60 combat missions were not nearly enough, and that he ought to increase the number at once to 70, 80, 100, or even 200, 300, or 6,000. Certainly he would be much better off under somebody suave like General Peckham than he was under somebody boorish and insensitive like General Dreedle, because General Peckham had the discernment, the intelligence, and the Ivy League background to appreciate and enjoy him at his full value, although General Peckham had never given the slightest indication that he appreciated or enjoyed him at all. Colonel Cathcart felt perceptive enough to realize that visible signals of recognition were never necessary between sophisticated, self-assured people like himself and General Peckham, who could warm to each other from a distance with innate mutual understanding. It was enough that they were of like kind, and he knew it was only a matter of waiting discreetly for preferment until the right time, although it rotted Colonel Cathcart's self-esteem to observe that General Peckham never deliberately sought him out, and that he labored no harder to impress Colonel Cathcart with his epigrams and erudition than he did to impress anyone else in earshot, even enlisted men. Either Colonel Cathcart wasn't getting through to General Peckham, or General Peckham was not the scintillating, discriminating, intellectual, forward-looking personality he pretended to be, and it was really General Dreedle who was sensitive, charming, brilliant, and sophisticated, and under whom he would certainly be much better off. And suddenly Colonel Cathcart had absolutely no conception of how strongly he stood with anyone, and began banging on his buzzer with his fist for Colonel Korn to come running into his office and assure him that everybody loved him, that Yossarian was a figment of his imagination, and that he was making wonderful progress in the splendid and valiant campaign he was waging to become a general. Actually, Colonel Cathcart did not have a chance in hell of becoming a general. For one thing, there was ex-PFC Wintergreen, who also wanted to be a general, and who always distorted, destroyed, rejected, or misdirected any correspondence by, for, or about Colonel Cathcart that might do him credit. For another, there already was a general, General Dreedle, who knew that General Peckham was after his job, but did not know how to stop him. General Dreedle, the wing commander, was a blunt, chunky, barrel-chested man in his early 50s. His nose was squat and red, and he had lumpy, white, bunched-up eyelids circling his small gray eyes like halos of bacon fat. He had a nurse and a son-in-law, and was prone to long, ponderous silences when he had not been drinking too much. General Dreedle had wasted too much of his time in the army doing his job well, and now it was too late. New power alignments had coalesced without him, and he was at a loss to cope with them. At unguarded moments, his hard and sullen face slipped into a somber, preoccupied look of defeat and frustration. General Dreedle drank a great deal. His moods were arbitrary and unpredictable. War is hell, he declared frequently, drunk or sober, and he really meant it, although that did not prevent him from making a good living out of it, or from taking his son-in-law into the business with him, even though the two bickered constantly. That bastard, General Dreedle would complain about his son-in-law with a contemptuous grunt to anyone who happened to be standing beside him at the curve of the bar of the officers' club. Everything he's got he owes to me. I made him, that lousy son of a bitch. He hasn't got brains enough to get ahead on his own. He thinks he knows everything, Colonel Mudis would retort in a sulking tone to his own audience at the other end of the bar. He can't take criticism, and he won't listen to advice. All he can do is give advice, General Dreedle would observe with a rasping snort. If it wasn't for me, he'd still be a corporal. General Dreedle was always accompanied by both Colonel Mudis and his nurse, who was as delectable a piece of ass as anyone who saw her had ever laid eyes on. General Dreedle's nurse was chubby, short, and blonde. She had plump, dimpled cheeks, happy blue eyes, and neat, curly, turned-up hair. She smiled at everyone and never spoke at all unless she was spoken to. Her bosom was lush and her complexion clear. She was irresistible, and men edged away from her carefully. She was succulent, sweet, docile, and dumb, and she drove everyone crazy but General Dreedle. You should see her naked, General Dreedle chortled with croupy relish, while his nurse stood smiling proudly right at his shoulder. Back at wing, she's got a uniform in my room made of purple silk that's so tight her nipples stand out like Bing cherries. Milo got me the fabric. There isn't even room enough for panties or a brassiere underneath. I make her wear it some nights when Mudis is around, just to drive him crazy. General Dreedle laughed hoarsely. You should see what goes on inside that blouse of hers every time she shifts her weight. She drives him out of his mind. The first time I catch him putting a hand on her, or any other woman, I'll bust the horny bastard right down to private and keep him on KP for a year. He keeps her around just to drive me crazy, Colonel Mudis accused aggrievedly at the other end of the bar. Back at wing, she's got a uniform made out of purple silk that's so tight her nipples stand out like Bing cherries. There isn't even room for panties or a brassiere underneath. You should hear that silk rustle every time she shifts her weight. The first time I make a pass at her or any other girl, he'll bust me right down to private and put me on KP for a year. She drives me out of my mind. He hasn't gotten laid since we shipped overseas, confided General Dreedle, and his square, grizzled head bobbed with sadistic laughter at the fiendish idea. That's one of the reasons I never let him out of my sight, just so he can't get to a woman. Can you imagine what that poor son of a bitch is going through? I haven't been to bed with a woman since we shipped overseas, Colonel Mudis whimpered tearfully. Can you imagine what I'm going through? General Dreedle could be as intransigent with anyone else when displeased as he was with Colonel Mudis. He had no taste for sham, tact, or pretension, and his credo as a professional soldier was unified and concise. He believed that the young men who took orders from him should be willing to give up their lives for the ideals, aspirations, and idiosyncrasies of the old men he took orders from. The officers and enlisted men in his command had identity for him only as military quantities. All he asked was that they do their work. Beyond that, they were free to do whatever they pleased. They were free, as Colonel Cathcart was free, to force their men to fly 60 missions if they chose, and they were free, as Yossarian had been free, to stand in formation naked if they wanted to, although General Dreedle's granite jaw swung open at the sight, and he went striding dictatorially right down the line to make certain that there really was a man wearing nothing but moccasins, waiting at attention in ranks to receive a medal from him. General Dreedle was speechless. Colonel Cathcart began to faint when he spied Yossarian, and Colonel Korn stepped up behind him and squeezed his arm in a strong grip. The silence was grotesque. A steady, warm wind flowed in from the beach, and an old cart filled with dirty straw rumbled into view on the main road, drawn by a black donkey and driven by a farmer in a flopping hat and faded brown work clothes, who paid no attention to the formal military ceremony taking place in the small field on his right. At last, General Dreedle spoke. "Get back in the car," he snapped over his shoulder to his nurse, who had followed him down the line. The nurse toddled away with a smile toward his brown staff car, parked about 20 yards away at the edge of the rectangular clearing. General Dreedle waited in austere silence until the car door slammed, and then demanded, "Which one is this?" Colonel Mudis checked his roster. "This one is Yossarian, Dad. He gets a distinguished flying cross." "Well, I'll be damned," mumbled General Dreedle, and his ruddy, monolithic face softened with amusement. "Why aren't you wearing clothes, Yossarian?" "I don't want to." "What do you mean you don't want to? Why the hell don't you want to?" "I just don't want to, sir." "Why isn't he wearing clothes?" General Dreedle demanded over his shoulder of Colonel Cathcart. "He's talking to you," Colonel Korn whispered over Colonel Cathcart's shoulder from behind, jabbing his elbow sharply into Colonel Cathcart's back. "Why isn't he wearing clothes?" Colonel Cathcart demanded of Colonel Korn with a look of acute pain, tenderly nursing the spot where Colonel Korn had just jabbed him. "Why isn't he wearing clothes?" Colonel Korn demanded of Captain Pilchard and Captain Wren. "A man was killed in his plane over Avignon last week and bled all over him," Captain Wren replied. "He swears he's never going to wear a uniform again." "A man was killed in his plane over Avignon last week and bled all over him," Colonel Korn reported directly to General Dreedle. "His uniform hasn't come back from the laundry yet." "Where are his other uniforms?" "They're in the laundry, too." "What about his underwear?" General Dreedle demanded. "All his underwear's in the laundry, too," answered Colonel Korn. "That sounds like a lot of crap to me," General Dreedle declared. "It is a lot of crap, sir," Yossarian said. "Don't you worry, sir," Colonel Cathcart promised General Dreedle with a threatening look at Yossarian. "You have my personal word for it that this man will be severely punished." "What the hell do I care if he's punished or not?" General Dreedle replied with surprise and irritation. "He's just won a medal. If he wants to receive it without any clothes on, what the hell business is it of yours?" "Those are my sentiments exactly, sir," Colonel Cathcart echoed with resounding enthusiasm, and mopped his brow with a damp white handkerchief. "But would you say that, sir, even in the light of General Peckham's recent memorandum on the subject of appropriate military attire in combat areas?" "Peckham?" General Dreedle's face clouded. "Yes, sir," said Colonel Cathcart obsequiously. "General Peckham even recommends that we send our men into combat in full-dress uniform, so they'll make a good impression on the enemy when they're shot down." "Peckham?" repeated General Dreedle, still squinting with bewilderment. "Just what the hell does Peckham have to do with it?" Colonel Korn jabbed Colonel Cathcart sharply again in the back with his elbow. "Absolutely nothing, sir," Colonel Cathcart responded sprucely, wincing in extreme pain and gingerly rubbing the spot where Colonel Korn had just jabbed him again. "And that's exactly why I decided to take absolutely no action at all until I first had an opportunity to discuss it with you. Shall we ignore it completely, sir?" "And that's exactly why I decided to take absolutely no action at all until I first had an opportunity to discuss it with you. Shall we ignore it completely, sir?" General Dreedle ignored him completely, turning away from him in baleful scorn to hand Yossarian his medal in its case. "Get my girl back from the car," he commanded Colonel Mudis crabbily, and waited in one spot with his scowling face down until his nurse had rejoined him. "Get word to the office right away to kill that directive I just issued, ordering the men to wear neckties on the combat missions," Colonel Cathcart whispered to Colonel Korn urgently out of the corner of his mouth. "I told you not to do it," Colonel Korn snickered, "but you just wouldn't listen to me." "Shh," Colonel Cathcart cautioned. "God damn it, Korn! What did you do to my back?" Colonel Korn snickered again. General Dreedle's nurse always followed General Dreedle everywhere he went, even into the briefing room just before the mission to Avignon, where she stood with her asinine smile at the side of the platform and bloomed like a fertile oasis at General Dreedle's shoulder in her pink and green uniform. Yossarian looked at her and fell in love, desperately. His spirits sank, leaving him empty inside and numb. He sat gazing in clammy want at her full red lips and dimpled cheeks as he listened to Major Danby describe in a monotonous, didactic male drone the heavy concentrations of flak awaiting them at Avignon, and he moaned in deep despair suddenly at the thought that he might never see again this lovely woman to whom he had never spoken a word and whom he now loved so pathetically. He throbbed and ached with sorrow, fear, and desire as he stared at her. She was so beautiful. He worshipped the ground she stood on. He licked his parched, thirsting lips with a sticky tongue and moaned in misery again, loudly enough this time to attract the startled, searching glances of the men sitting around him on the rows of crude wooden benches in their chocolate-colored coveralls and stitched white parachute harnesses. Nately turned to him quickly with alarm. "What is it?" he whispered. "What's the matter?" Yossarian did not hear him. He was sick with lust and mesmerized with regret. General Dreedle's nurse was only a little chubby, and his senses were stuffed to congestion with the yellow radiance of her hair and the unfelt pressure of her soft, short fingers, with the rounded, untasted wealth of her nubile breasts in her army pink shirt that was opened wide at the throat, and with the rolling, ripened, triangular confluences of her belly and thighs in her tight, slick forest green gabardine officer's pants. He drank her in insatiably from head to painted toenail. He never wanted to lose her. "Ooh," he moaned again, and this time the whole room rippled at his quavering, drawn-out cry. A wave of startled uneasiness broke over the officers on the dais, and even Major Danby, who had begun synchronizing the watches, was distracted momentarily as he counted out the seconds and almost had to begin again. Nately followed Yossarian's transfixed gaze down the long frame auditorium until he came to General Dreedle's nurse. He blanched with trepidation when he guessed what was troubling Yossarian. "Cut it out, will you?" Nately warned in a fierce whisper. "Ooh," Yossarian moaned a fourth time, this time loudly enough for everyone to hear him distinctly. "Are you crazy?" Nately hissed vehemently. "You'll get into trouble." "Ooh," Dunbar answered Yossarian from the opposite end of the room. Nately recognized Dunbar's voice. The situation was now out of control, and he turned away with a small moan. "Ooh, ooh," Dunbar moaned back at him. "Ooh," Nately moaned out loud in exasperation when he realized that he had just moaned. "Ooh," Dunbar moaned back at him again. "Ooh," someone entirely new chimed in from another section of the room, and Nately's hair stood on end. Yossarian and Dunbar both replied, while Nately cringed and hunted about futilely for some hole in which to hide and take Yossarian with him. A sprinkling of people were smothering laughter. An elfin impulse possessed Nately, and he moaned intentionally the next time there was a lull. Another new voice answered. The flavor of disobedience was titillating, and Nately moaned deliberately again, the next time he could squeeze one in edgewise. Still another new voice echoed him. The room was boiling irrepressibly into bedlam. An eerie hubbub of voices was rising. Feet were scuffled, and things began to drop from people's fingers. Pencils, computers, map cases, clattering steel flak helmets. A number of men who were not moaning were now giggling openly, and there was no telling how far the unorganized insurrection of moaning might have gone if General Dreedle himself had not come forward to quell it, stepping out determinedly in the center of the platform directly in front of Major Danby, who, with his earnest, persevering head down, was still concentrating on his wristwatch and saying, 25 seconds, 20, 15... General Dreedle's great red domineering face was gnarled with perplexity and oaken with awesome resolution. "That will be all, men," he ordered tersely, his eyes glaring with disapproval and his square jaw firm. And that's all there was. "I run a fighting outfit," he told them sternly when the room had grown absolutely quiet and the men on the benches were all cowering sheepishly. "And there'll be no more moaning in this group as long as I'm in command. Is that clear?" It was clear to everybody but Major Danby, who was still concentrating on his wristwatch and counting down the seconds aloud. 4, 3, 2, 1, time, called out Major Danby, and raised his eyes triumphantly to discover that no one had been listening to him, and that he would have to begin all over again. "Ooh," he moaned in frustration. "What was that?" roared General Dreedle incredulously, and whirled around in a murderous rage upon Major Danby, who staggered back in terrified confusion and began to quail and perspire. "Who is this man?" "Major Danby, sir," Colonel Cathcart stammered. "My group operations officer." "Take him out and shoot him," ordered General Dreedle. "Sir? I said take him out and shoot him, can't you hear? Yes, sir, Colonel Cathcart responded smartly, swallowing hard, and turned in a brisk manner to his chauffeur and his meteorologist. Take Major Danby out and shoot him. Sir? His chauffeur and his meteorologist stammered. I said take Major Danby out and shoot him, Colonel Cathcart snapped. Can't you hear? The two young lieutenants nodded lumpishly and gaped at each other in stunned and flaccid reluctance, each waiting for the other to initiate the procedure of taking Major Danby outside and shooting him. Neither had ever taken Major Danby outside and shot him before. They inched their way dubiously toward Major Danby from opposite sides. Major Danby was white with fear. His legs collapsed suddenly, and he began to fall, and the two young lieutenants sprang forward and seized him under both arms to save him from slumping to the floor. Now that they had Major Danby, the rest seemed easy, but there were no guns. Major Danby began to cry. Colonel Cathcart wanted to rush to his side and comfort him, but did not want to look like a sissy in front of General Dreedle. He remembered that Appleby and Havermeyer always brought their .45 automatics on the missions, and he began to scan the rows of men in search of them. As soon as Major Danby began to cry, Colonel Mudis, who had been vacillating wretchedly on the sidelines, could restrain himself no longer, and stepped out diffidently toward General Dreedle with a sickly air of self-sacrifice. I think you'd better wait a minute, Dad, he suggested hesitantly. I don't think you can shoot him. General Dreedle was infuriated by his intervention. Who the hell says I can't? He thundered pugnaciously in a voice loud enough to rattle the whole building. Colonel Mudis, his face flushing with embarrassment, bent close to whisper into his ear. Why the hell can't I? General Dreedle bellowed. Colonel Mudis whispered some more. You mean I can't shoot anyone I want to? General Dreedle demanded with uncompromising indignation. He pricked up his ears with interest as Colonel Mudis continued whispering. Is that a fact? He inquired, his rage tamed by curiosity. Yes, Dad, I'm afraid it is. I guess you think you're pretty goddamn smart, don't you? General Dreedle lashed out at Colonel Mudis suddenly. Colonel Mudis turned crimson again. No, Dad, it isn't. All right, let the insubordinate son of a bitch go, General Dreedle snarled, turning bitterly away from his son-in-law and barking peevishly at Colonel Cathcart's chauffeur and Colonel Cathcart's meteorologist. But get him out of this building and keep him out. And let's continue this goddamn briefing before the war ends. I've never seen so much incompetence. Colonel Cathcart nodded lamely at General Dreedle and signaled his men hurriedly to push Major Danby outside the building. As soon as Major Danby had been pushed outside, though, there was no one to continue the briefing. Everyone gawked at everyone else in oafish surprise. General Dreedle turned purple with rage as nothing happened. Colonel Cathcart had no idea what to do. He was about to begin moaning aloud when Colonel Korn came to the rescue by stepping forward and taking control. Colonel Cathcart sighed with enormous, tearful relief, almost overwhelmed with gratitude. Now, men, we're going to synchronize our watches, Colonel Korn began promptly, in a sharp, commanding manner, rolling his eyes flirtatiously in General Dreedle's direction. We're going to synchronize our watches one time, and one time only. And if it doesn't come off in that one time, General Dreedle and I are going to want to know why. Is that clear? He fluttered his eyes toward General Dreedle again to make sure his plug had registered. Now set your watches for 9:18. Colonel Korn synchronized their watches without a single hitch and moved ahead with confidence. He gave the men the colors of the day and reviewed the weather conditions with an agile, flashy versatility, casting sidelong, simpering looks at General Dreedle every few seconds to draw increased encouragement from the excellent impression he saw he was making. Preening and pruning himself effulgently and strutting vaingloriously about the platform as he picked up momentum, he gave the men the colors of the day again and shifted nimbly into a rousing pep talk on the importance of the bridge at Avignon to the war effort and the obligation of each man on the mission to place love of country above love of life. When his inspiring dissertation was finished, he gave the men the colors of the day still one more time, stressed the angle of approach, and reviewed the weather conditions again. Colonel Korn felt himself at the full height of his powers. He belonged in the spotlight. Comprehension dawned slowly on Colonel Cathcart. When it came, he was struck dumb. His face grew longer and longer as he enviously watched Colonel Korn's treachery continue, and he was almost afraid to listen when General Dreedle moved up beside him and in a whisper blustery enough to be heard throughout the room demanded, "Who is that man?" Colonel Cathcart answered with wan foreboding, and General Dreedle then cupped his hand over his mouth and whispered something that made Colonel Cathcart's face glow with immense joy. Colonel Korn saw and quivered with uncontrollable rapture. Had he just been promoted in the field by General Dreedle to full colonel, he could not endure the suspense. With a masterful flourish, he brought the briefing to a close and turned expectantly to receive ardent congratulations from General Dreedle, who was already striding out of the building without a glance backward, trailing his nurse and Colonel Mudis behind him. Colonel Korn was stunned by this disappointing sight, but only for an instant. His eyes found Colonel Cathcart, who was still standing erect in a grinning trance, and he rushed over jubilantly and began pulling on his arm. "What did he say about me?" he demanded excitedly in a fervor of proud and blissful anticipation. "What did General Dreedle say? He wanted to know who you were." I know that, but what did he say about me? What did he say?" "You make him sick." Chapter 22. Milo the Mayor. That was the mission on which Yossarian lost his nerve. Yossarian lost his nerve on the mission to Avignon because Snowden lost his guts. And Snowden lost his guts because their pilot that day was Huppel, who was only 15 years old, and their co-pilot was Dobbs, who was even worse, and who wanted Yossarian to join with him in a plot to murder Colonel Cathcart. Huppel was a good pilot, Yossarian knew, but he was only a kid, and Dobbs had no confidence in him either, and wrestled the controls away without warning after they had dropped their bombs, going berserk in midair and tipping the plane over into that heart-stopping, ear-splitting, indescribably petrifying, fatal dive that tore Yossarian's earphones free from their connection and hung him helplessly to the roof of the nose by the top of his head. "Oh, God," Yossarian had shrieked soundlessly as he felt them all falling. "Oh, God, oh, God, oh, God, oh, God," he had shrieked beseechingly through lips that could not open as the plane fell and he dangled without weight by the top of his head until Huppel managed to seize the controls back and leveled the plane out down inside the crazy, craggy patchwork canyon of crashing anti-aircraft fire from which they had climbed away and from which they would now have to escape again. Almost at once there was a thud and a hole the size of a big fist in the plexiglass. Yossarian's cheeks were stinging with shimmering splinters. There was no blood. "What happened? What happened?" he cried, and trembled violently when he could not hear his own voice in his ears. He was cowed by the empty silence on the intercom and almost too horrified to move as he crouched like a trapped mouse on his hands and knees and waited without daring to breathe until he finally spied the gleaming cylindrical jack plug of his headset swinging back and forth in front of his eyes and jammed it back into its receptacle with fingers that rattled. "Oh, God!" he kept shrieking with no abatement of terror as the flak thumped and mushroomed all around him. "Oh, God!" Dobbs was weeping when Yossarian jammed his jack plug back into the intercom system and was able to hear again. "Help him! Help him!" Dobbs was sobbing. "Help him! Help him!" "Help who? Help who?" Yossarian called back. "Help who?" "The bombardier! The bombardier!" Dobbs cried. "He doesn't answer! Help the bombardier! Help the bombardier!" "I'm the bombardier!" Yossarian cried back at him. "I'm the bombardier! I'm all right! I'm all right!" "Then help him! Help him!" Dobbs wept. "Help him! Help him!" "Help who? Help who?" "The radio gunner," Dobbs begged. "Help the radio gunner." "I'm cold," Snowden whimpered feebly over the intercom system then in a bleat of plaintive agony. "Please help me. I'm cold." And Yossarian crept out through the crawlway and climbed up over the bomb bay and down into the rear section of the plane, where Snowden lay on the floor, wounded and freezing to death, in a yellow splash of sunlight near the new tail gunner, lying stretched out on the floor beside him in a dead faint. Dobbs was the worst pilot in the world and knew it, a shattered wreck of a virile young man who was continually striving to convince his superiors that he was no longer fit to pilot a plane. None of his superiors would listen, and it was the day the number of missions was raised to 60 that Dobbs stole into Yossarian's tent while Orr was out looking for gaskets and disclosed the plot he had formulated to murder Colonel Cathcart. He needed Yossarian's assistance. "You want us to kill him in cold blood?" Yossarian objected. "That's right," Dobbs agreed with an optimistic smile, encouraged by Yossarian's ready grasp of the situation. We shoot him to death with the Luger I brought back from Sicily that nobody knows I've got. I don't think I could do it, Yossarian concluded, after weighing the idea in silence a while. Dobbs was astonished. Why not? Look, nothing would please me more than to have the son of a bitch break his neck or get killed in a crash, or to find out that someone else had shot him to death. But I don't think I could kill him. He'd do it to you, Dobbs argued. In fact, you're the one who told me he is doing it to us by keeping us in combat so long. But I don't think I could do it to him. He's got a right to live too, I guess. Not as long as he's trying to rob you and me of our right to live. What's the matter with you? Dobbs was flabbergasted. I used to listen to you arguing that same thing with Clevenger, and look what happened to him, right inside that cloud. Stop shouting, will you? Yossarian shushed him. I'm not shouting, Dobbs shouted louder, his face red with revolutionary fervor. His eyes and nostrils were running, and his palpitating crimson lower lip was splattered with a foamy dew. There must have been close to 100 men in the group who had finished their 55 missions when he raised the number to 60. There must have been at least another 100 like you with just a couple more to fly. He's going to kill us all if we let him go on forever. We've got to kill him first. Yossarian nodded expressionlessly without committing himself. Do you think we could get away with it? I've got it all worked out. Stop shouting, for Christ's sake. I'm not shouting. I've got it. Will you stop shouting? I've got it all worked out, Dobbs whispered, gripping the side of Orr's cot with white-knuckled hands to constrain them from waving. Thursday morning, when he's due back from that goddamn farmhouse of his in the hills, I'll sneak up through the woods to that hairpin turn in the road and hide in the bushes. He has to slow down there, and I can watch the road in both directions to make sure there's no one else around. When I see him coming, I'll shove a big log out into the road to make him stop his jeep. Then I'll step out of the bushes with my Luger and shoot him in the head until he's dead. I'll bury the gun, come back down through the woods to the squadron, and go about my business just like everybody else. What could possibly go wrong? Yossarian had followed each step attentively. Where do I come in? He asked in puzzlement. Well, I couldn't do it without you, Dobbs explained. I need you to tell me to go ahead. Yossarian found it hard to believe him. Is that all you want me to do, just tell you to go ahead? That's all I need from you, Dobbs answered. Just tell me to go ahead and I'll blow his brains out all by myself the day after tomorrow. His voice was accelerating with emotion and rising again. I'd like to shoot Colonel Korn in the head, too, while we're at it, although I'd like to spare Major Danby, if that's all right with you. Then I'd like to murder Appleby and Havermeyer also, and after we finish murdering Appleby and Havermeyer, I'd like to murder McWatt. McWatt? Cried Yossarian, almost jumping up in horror. McWatt's a friend of mine. What do you want from McWatt? I don't know, Dobbs confessed with an air of floundering embarrassment. I just thought that as long as we were murdering Appleby and Havermeyer, we might as well murder McWatt, too. Don't you want to murder McWatt? Yossarian took a firm stand. Look, I might keep interested in this if you stop shouting it all over the island, and if you stick to killing Colonel Cathcart. But if you're going to turn this into a bloodbath, you can forget about me. All right, Dobbs sought to placate him. Just Colonel Cathcart. Should I do it? Tell me to go ahead. Yossarian shook his head. I don't think I could tell you to go ahead. Dobbs was frantic. I'm willing to compromise, he pleaded vehemently. You don't have to tell me to go ahead. Just tell me it's a good idea, okay? Is it a good idea? Yossarian still shook his head. It would have been a great idea if you had gone ahead and done it without even speaking to me. Now it's too late. I don't think I can tell you anything. Give me some more time. I might change my mind. Then it will be too late. Yossarian kept shaking his head. Dobbs was disappointed. He sat for a moment with a hangdog look, then spurted to his feet suddenly and stamped away to have another impetuous crack at persuading Doc Danica to ground him, knocking over Yossarian's washstand with his hip when he lurched around, and tripping over the fuel line of the stove Orr was still constructing. Doc Danica withstood Dobbs' blustering and gesticulating attack with a series of impatient nods and sent him to the medical tent to describe his symptoms to Gus and Wes, who painted his gums purple with gentian violet solution the moment he started to talk. They painted his toes purple, too, and forced a laxative down his throat when he opened his mouth again to complain, and then they sent him away. Dobbs was in even worse shape than Hungry Joe, who could at least fly missions when he was not having nightmares. Dobbs was almost as bad as Orr, who seemed happy as an undersized, grinning lark with his deranged and galvanic giggle and shivering, warped buck teeth, and who was sent along for a rest leave with Milo and Yossarian on the trip to Cairo for eggs, when Milo bought cotton instead, and took off at dawn for Istanbul with his plane packed to the gun turrets with exotic spiders and unripened red bananas. Orr was one of the homeliest freaks Yossarian had ever encountered, and one of the most attractive. He had a raw, bulgy face with hazel eyes squeezing from their sockets like matching brown halves of marbles, and thick, wavy, parti-colored hair sloping up to a peak on the top of his head like a pomaded pup tent. Orr was knocked down into the water or had an engine shot out almost every time he went up, and he began jerking on Yossarian's arm like a wild man after they had taken off for Naples and come down in Sicily to find the scheming, cigar-smoking 10-year-old pimp with the two 12-year-old virgin sisters waiting for them in town in front of the hotel, in which there was room for only Milo. Yossarian pulled back from Orr adamantly, gazing with some concern and bewilderment at Mount Etna instead of Mount Vesuvius, and wondering what they were doing in Sicily instead of Naples, as Orr kept entreating him in a tittering, stuttering, concupiscent turmoil to go along with him behind the scheming 10-year-old pimp to his two 12-year-old virgin sisters, who were not really virgins and not really sisters, and who were really only 28. "Go with him," Milo instructed Yossarian laconically. "Remember your mission." "All right," Yossarian yielded with a sigh, remembering his mission. "But at least let me try to find a hotel room first so I can get a good night's sleep afterward." "You'll get a good night's sleep with the girls," Milo replied with the same air of intrigue. "Remember your mission." But they got no sleep at all, for Yossarian and Orr found themselves jammed into the same double bed with the two 12-year-old, 28-year-old prostitutes, who turned out to be oily and obese, and who kept waking them up all night long to ask them to switch partners. Yossarian's perceptions were soon so fuzzy that he paid no notice to the beige turban the fat one crowding into him kept wearing until late the next morning, when the scheming 10-year-old pimp with the Cuban panatella snatched it off in public in a bestial caprice that exposed in the brilliant Sicilian daylight her shocking, misshapen, and denudate skull. Vengeful neighbors had shaved her hair to the gleaming bone because she had slept with Germans. The girl screeched in feminine outrage and waddled comically after the scheming 10-year-old pimp, her grisly, bleak, violated scalp slithering up and down ludicrously around the queer, darkened wart of her face like something bleached and obscene. Yossarian had never laid eyes on anything so bare before. The pimp spun the turban high on his finger like a trophy and kept himself skipping inches ahead of her fingertips as he led her in a tantalizing circle around the square, congested with people who were howling with laughter and pointing to Yossarian with derision when Milo strode up with a grim look of haste and puckered his lips reprovingly at the unseemly spectacle of so much vice and frivolity. Milo insisted on leaving at once for Malta. "We're sleepy," Orr whined. "That's your own fault," Milo censured them both self-righteously. "If you had spent the night in your hotel room instead of with these immoral girls, you'd both feel as good as I do today." "You told us to go with them," Yossarian retorted accusingly. "And we didn't have a hotel room. You were the only one who could get a hotel room." "That wasn't my fault either," Milo explained haughtily. "How was I supposed to know all the buyers would be in town for the chickpea harvest?" "You knew it," Yossarian charged. "That explains why we're here in Sicily instead of Naples. You've probably got the whole damned plane filled with chickpeas already." "Shh," Milo cautioned sternly, with a meaningful glance toward Orr. "Remember your mission." The bomb bay, the rear and tail sections of the plane, and most of the top turret gunner's section were all filled with bushels of chickpeas when they arrived at the airfield to take off for Malta. Yossarian's mission on the trip was to distract Orr from observing where Milo bought his eggs, even though Orr was a member of Milo's syndicate and, like every other member of Milo's syndicate, owned a share. His mission was silly, Yossarian felt, since it was common knowledge that Milo bought his eggs in Malta for 7 cents apiece and sold them to the mess halls in his syndicate for 5 cents apiece. "I just don't trust him," Milo brooded in the plane with a backward nod toward Orr, who was curled up like a tangled rope on the low bushels of chickpeas, trying torturedly to sleep. "And I'd just as soon buy my eggs when he's not around to learn my business secrets. What else don't you understand?" Yossarian was riding beside him in the co-pilot's seat. "I don't understand why you buy eggs for 7 cents apiece in Malta and sell them for 5 cents. I do it to make a profit." "But how can you make a profit? You lose 2 cents an egg." But I make a profit of 3¼ cents an egg by selling them for 4¼ cents an egg to the people in Malta I buy them from for 7 cents an egg. Of course, I don't make the profit. The syndicate makes the profit, and everybody has a share. Yossarian felt he was beginning to understand. And the people you sell the eggs to at 4¼ cents apiece make a profit of 2¾ cents apiece when they sell them back to you at 7 cents apiece. Is that right? Why don't you sell the eggs directly to you and eliminate the people you buy them from? Because I'm the people I buy them from, Milo explained. I make a profit of 3¼ cents apiece when I sell them to me, and a profit of 2¾ cents apiece when I buy them back from me. That's a total profit of 6 cents an egg. I lose only 2 cents an egg when I sell them to the mess halls at 5 cents apiece, and that's how I can make a profit buying eggs for 7 cents apiece and selling them for 5 cents apiece. I pay only 1 cent apiece at the hen when I buy them in Sicily. In Malta, Yossarian corrected. You buy your eggs in Malta, not Sicily. Milo chortled proudly. I don't buy eggs in Malta, he confessed, with an air of slight and clandestine amusement that was the only departure from industrious sobriety Yossarian had ever seen him make. I buy them in Sicily for 1 cent apiece, and transfer them to Malta secretly at 4½ cents apiece in order to get the price of eggs up to 7 cents apiece when people come to Malta looking for them. Why do people come to Malta for eggs when they're so expensive there? Because they've always done it that way. Why don't they look for eggs in Sicily? Because they've never done it that way. Now I really don't understand. Why don't you sell your mess halls the eggs for 7 cents apiece instead of for 5 cents apiece? Because my mess halls would have no need for me then. Anyone can buy 7 cent apiece eggs for 7 cents apiece. Why don't they bypass you and buy the eggs directly from you in Malta at 4¼ cents apiece? Because I wouldn't sell it to them. Why wouldn't you sell it to them? Because then there wouldn't be as much room for a profit. At least this way I can make a bit for myself as a middleman. Then you do make a profit for yourself, Yossarian declared. Of course I do, but it all goes to the syndicate, and everybody has a share. Don't you understand? It's exactly what happens with those plum tomatoes I sell to Colonel Cathcart. Buy, Yossarian corrected. You don't sell plum tomatoes to Colonel Cathcart and Colonel Korn. You buy plum tomatoes from them. No, sell, Milo corrected Yossarian. I distribute my plum tomatoes in markets all over Pianosa under an assumed name so that Colonel Cathcart and Colonel Korn can buy them up from me under their assumed names at 4 cents apiece and sell them back to me the next day for the syndicate at 5 cents apiece. They make a profit of 1 cent apiece. I make a profit of 3½ cents apiece, and everybody comes out ahead. Everybody but the syndicate, said Yossarian with a snort. The syndicate is paying 5 cents apiece for plum tomatoes that cost you only ½ cent apiece. How does the syndicate benefit? The syndicate benefits when I benefit, Milo explained, because everybody has a share, and the syndicate gets Colonel Cathcart's and Colonel Korn's support so that they'll let me go out on trips like this one. You'll see how much profit that can mean in about 15 minutes when we land in Palermo. Malta, Yossarian corrected him. We're flying to Malta now, not Palermo. No, we're flying to Palermo, Milo answered. There's an endive exporter in Palermo I have to see for a minute about a shipment of mushrooms to Bern that were damaged by mold. Milo, how do you do it? Yossarian inquired with laughing amazement and admiration. You fill out a flight plan for one place and then you go to another. Don't the people in the control towers ever raise hell? They all belong to the syndicate, Milo said. And they know that what's good for the syndicate is good for the country, because that's what makes Sammy run. The men in the control towers have a share, too, and that's why they always have to do whatever they can to help the syndicate. Do I have a share? Everybody has a share. Does Orr have a share? Everybody has a share. And Hungry Joe, he has a share, too? Everybody has a share. Well, I'll be damned, mused Yossarian, deeply impressed with the idea of a share for the very first time. Milo turned toward him with a faint glimmer of mischief. I have a surefire plan for cheating the federal government out of $6,000. We can make $3,000 apiece without any risk to either of us. Are you interested? No. Milo looked at Yossarian with profound emotion. That's what I like about you, he exclaimed. You're honest. You're the only one I know that I can really trust. That's why I wish you'd try to be of more help to me. I really was disappointed when you ran off with those 2 tramps in Catania yesterday. Yossarian stared at Milo in quizzical disbelief. Milo, you told me to go with them, don't you remember? That wasn't my fault, Milo answered with dignity. I had to get rid of Orr some way once we reached town. It will be a lot different in Palermo. When we land in Palermo, I want you and Orr to leave with the girls right from the airport. With what girls? I radioed ahead and made arrangements with a 4-year-old pimp to supply you and Orr with 2 8-year-old virgins who are half Spanish. He'll be waiting at the airport in a limousine. Go right in as soon as you step out of the plane. Nothing doing, Yossarian said, shaking his head. The only place I'm going is to sleep. Milo turned livid with indignation, his slim, long nose flickering spasmodically between his black eyebrows, and his unbalanced orange-brown mustache like the pale, thin flame of a single candle. Yossarian, remember your mission, he reminded reverently. To hell with my mission, Yossarian responded indifferently, and to hell with the syndicate, too, even though I do have a share. I don't want any 8-year-old virgins, even if they are half Spanish. I don't blame you, but these 8-year-old virgins are really only 32, and they're not really half Spanish, but only 1/3 Estonian. I don't care for any virgins. And they're not even virgins, Milo continued persuasively. The one I picked out for you was married for a short time to an elderly schoolteacher who slept with her only on Sundays, so she's really almost as good as new. But Orr was sleepy, too, and Yossarian and Orr were both at Milo's side when they rode into the city of Palermo from the airport and discovered that there was no room for the two of them at the hotel there either, and, more important, that Milo was mayor. The weird, implausible reception for Milo began at the airfield, where civilian laborers who recognized him halted in their duties respectfully to gaze at him with full expressions of controlled exuberance and adulation. News of his arrival preceded him into the city, and the outskirts were already crowded with cheering citizens as they sped by in their small, uncovered truck. Yossarian and Orr were mystified and mute and pressed close against Milo for security. Inside the city, the welcome for Milo grew louder as the truck slowed and eased deeper toward the middle of town. Small boys and girls had been released from school and were lining the sidewalks in new clothes, waving tiny flags. Yossarian and Orr were absolutely speechless now. The streets were jammed with joyous throngs, and strung overhead were huge banners bearing Milo's picture. Milo had posed for these pictures in a drab peasant's blouse with a high round collar, and his scrupulous paternal countenance was tolerant, wise, critical, and strong, as he stared out at the populace omnisciently with his undisciplined mustache and disunited eyes. Sinking invalids blew kisses to him from windows. Aproned shopkeepers cheered ecstatically from the narrow doorways of their shops. Tubas crumped. Here and there a person fell and was trampled to death. Sobbing old women swarmed through each other frantically around the slow-moving truck to touch Milo's shoulder or press his hand. Milo bore the tumultuous celebration with benevolent grace. He waved back to everyone in elegant reciprocation and showered generous handfuls of foil-covered Hershey kisses to the rejoicing multitudes. Lines of lusty young boys and girls skipped along behind him with their arms linked, chanting in hoarse and glassy-eyed adoration, "Milo, Milo, Milo." Now that his secret was out, Milo relaxed with Yossarian and Orr and inflated opulently with a vast, shy pride. His cheeks turned flesh-colored. Milo had been elected mayor of Palermo and of nearby Carini, Monreale, Bagheria, Termini Imerese, Celafe, Mistreta, and Nicosia as well, because he had brought Scotch to Sicily. Yossarian was amazed. The people here like to drink Scotch that much? They don't drink any of the Scotch, Milo explained. Scotch is very expensive, and these people here are very poor. Then why do you import it to Sicily if nobody drinks any? To build up a price. I moved the Scotch here from Malta to make more room for a profit when I sell it back to me for somebody else. I created a whole new industry here. Today, Sicily is the third largest exporter of Scotch in the world, and that's why they elected me mayor. How about getting us a hotel room if you're such a hot shot, Orr grumbled impertinently in a voice slurred with fatigue. Milo responded contritely, "That's just what I'm going to do," he promised. "I'm really sorry about forgetting to radio ahead for hotel rooms for you two. Come along to my office and I'll speak to my deputy mayor about it right now." Milo's office was a barber shop, and his deputy mayor was a pudgy barber from whose obsequious lips cordial greetings foamed as effusively as the lather he began whipping up in Milo's shaving cup. "Well, Vittorio," said Milo, settling back lazily in one of Vittorio's barber chairs, "how were things in my absence this time?" "Very sad, Signor Milo, very sad. But now that you are back, the people are all happy again." "I was wondering about the size of the crowds. How come all the hotels are full?" "Because so many people from other cities are here to see you, Signor Milo. And because we have all the buyers who have come into town for the artichoke auction." Milo's hand soared up perpendicularly like an eagle and arrested Vittorio's shaving brush. "What's artichoke?" he inquired. "Artichoke, Signor Milo. An artichoke is a very tasty vegetable that is popular everywhere. You must try some artichokes while you are here, Signor Milo. We grow the best in the world." "Really?" said Milo. "How much are artichokes selling for this year?" "It looks like a very good year for artichokes. The crops were very bad." "Is that a fact?" mused Milo, and was gone, sliding from his chair so swiftly that his striped barber's apron retained his shape for a second or two after he had gone before it collapsed. Milo had vanished from sight by the time Yossarian and Orr rushed after him to the doorway. "Next," barked Milo's deputy mayor officiously. "Who's next?" Yossarian and Orr walked from the barber shop in dejection. Deserted by Milo, they trudged homelessly through the reveling masses in futile search of a place to sleep. Yossarian was exhausted. His head throbbed with a dull, debilitating pain, and he was irritable with Orr, who had found 2 crab apples somewhere and walked with them in his cheeks until Yossarian spied them there and made him take them out. Then Orr found 2 horse chestnuts somewhere and slipped those in until Yossarian detected them and snapped at him again to take the crab apples out of his mouth. Orr grinned and replied that they were not crab apples but horse chestnuts, and that they were not in his mouth but in his hands. But Yossarian was not able to understand a single word he said because of the horse chestnuts in his mouth, and made him take them out anyway. A sly light twinkled in Orr's eyes. He rubbed his forehead harshly with his knuckles, like a man in an alcoholic stupor, and snickered lewdly. "Do you remember that girl?" He broke off to snicker lewdly again. "Do you remember that girl who was hitting me over the head with that shoe in that apartment in Rome when we were both naked?" he asked with a look of cunning expectation. He waited until Yossarian nodded cautiously. "If you let me put the chestnuts back in my mouth, I'll tell you why she was hitting me. Is that a deal?" Yossarian nodded, and Orr told him the whole fantastic story of why the naked girl in Nately's whore's apartment was hitting him over the head with her shoe. But Yossarian was not able to understand a single word because the horse chestnuts were back in his mouth. Yossarian roared with exasperated laughter at the trick, but in the end there was nothing for them to do when night fell but eat a damp dinner in a dirty restaurant and hitch a ride back to the airfield, where they slept on the chill metal floor of the plane and turned and tossed in groaning torment until the truck drivers blasted up less than 2 hours later with their crates of artichokes and chased them out onto the ground while they filled up the plane. A heavy rain began falling. Yossarian and Orr were dripping wet by the time the trucks drove away and had no choice but to squeeze themselves back into the plane and roll themselves up like shivering anchovies between the jolting corners of the crates of artichokes that Milo flew up to Naples at dawn and exchanged for the cinnamon sticks, cloves, vanilla beans, and pepper pods that he rushed right back down south with that same day to Malta, where, it turned out, he was Assistant Governor General. There was no room for Yossarian and Orr in Malta, either. Milo was Major Sir Milo Minderbinder in Malta and had a gigantic office in the Governor General's building. His mahogany desk was immense. In a panel of the oak wall, between crossed British flags, hung a dramatic, arresting photograph of Major Sir Milo Minderbinder in the dress uniform of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. His mustache in the photograph was clipped and narrow, his chin was chiseled, and his eyes were sharp as thorns. Milo had been knighted, commissioned a major in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and named Assistant Governor General of Malta, because he had brought the egg trade there. He gave Yossarian and Orr generous permission to spend the night on the thick carpet in his office, but shortly after he left, a sentry in battle dress appeared and drove them from the building at the tip of his bayonet, and they rode out exhaustedly to the airport with a surly cab driver who overcharged them, and went to sleep inside the plane again, which was filled now with leaking gunny sacks of cocoa and freshly ground coffee, and reeking with an odor so rich that they were both outside retching violently against the landing gear when Milo was chauffeured up the first thing the next morning, looking fit as a fiddle, and took right off for Oran, where there was again no room at the hotel for Yossarian and Orr, and where Milo was vice shah. Milo had at his disposal sumptuous quarters inside a salmon-pink palace, but Yossarian and Orr were not allowed to accompany him inside because they were Christian infidels. They were stopped at the gates by gargantuan Berber guards with scimitars and chased away. Orr was snuffling and sneezing with a crippling head cold. Yossarian's broad back was bent and aching. He was ready to break Milo's neck, but Milo was vice shah of Oran, and his person was sacred. Milo was not only the vice shah of Oran, as it turned out, but also the caliph of Baghdad, the imam of Damascus, and the sheikh of Araby. Milo was the corn god, the rain god, and the rice god in backward regions where such crude gods were still worshipped by ignorant and superstitious people. And deep inside the jungles of Africa, he intimated with becoming modesty, large graven images of his mustached face could be found overlooking primitive stone altars red with human blood.